a WikiVidi documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Generation Z. Generation Z or Gen Z, also known by a number of other names, is the demographic cohort after the millennials. Currently, there are numerous additional competing names used in connection with them in the media. There are no precise dates for when this cohort starts or ends, but demographers and researchers typically use the mid-1990s to mid-2000s as starting birth years. There is little consensus regarding ending birth years. Most of Generation Z have used the internet since a young age, and they are generally comfortable with technology and with interacting on social media. Terminology. William Strauss and Neil Howe wrote several books on the subject of generations and are widely credited with coining the term millennials. Howe has said, "No one knows who will name the next generation after the millennials." In 2005, their company sponsored an online contest in which respondents voted overwhelmingly for the name Homeland Generation. That was not long after the September 11th terrorist attacks, and one fallout of the disaster was that Americans may have felt more safe staying at home. Howe has described himself as not totally wed to the name, and cautioned that names are being invented by people who have a great press release. Everyone is looking for a hook. In 2012, USA Today sponsored an online contest for readers to choose the name of the next generation after the millennials. The name Generation Z was suggested, although journalist Bruce Horowitz thought that some might find the term off-putting. Some other names that were proposed included iGeneration, Gen Tech, Gen We, Net Gen, Digital Natives, and plurals. Post-millennial is a name given by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and Pew Research in statistics published in 2016 showing the relative sizes and dates of the generations. The same sources showed that as of April 2016, the millennial generation surpassed the population of baby boomers in the USA. However, the post-millennials were ahead of the millennials in another health and human services survey. iGeneration is a name that several persons claim to have coined. Demographer Cheryl Russell claims to have first used the term in 2009. Psychology professor and author Jean Twenge claims that the name iGen just popped into her head while she was driving near Silicon Valley, and that she had intended to use it as the title of her 2006 book Generation Me about the millennial generation, until it was overridden by her publisher. In 2012, Ad Age magazine thought that iGen was the name that best fits and will best lead to understanding of this generation. In 2014, an NPR News intern noted that iGeneration seems to be winning as the name for the post-millennials. Frank N. Magid Associates, an advertising and marketing agency, nicknamed this cohort the pluralist generation or plurals. Turner Broadcasting System also advocated calling the post-millennial generation plurals. MTV has labeled the generation the founders, based on the results of a survey they conducted in March 2015. MTV President Sean Atkins commented, "They have this self-awareness that systems have been broken, but they can't be the generation that says we'll break it even more." Cantor Futures has named this cohort the Centennials. In 2017, a BBC article was published that presented Generation Z individuals referring to themselves as innovative. Also in 2017, an Exago article described that doing business today requires understanding of the solid link between innovation and individuals belonging to the Generation Z group. In 2018, a New York Times survey saw support for the name Delta Generation or Deltas. The Times staff selected Delta Generation as its favorite label, with one submitter explaining, "Delta is used to denote change and uncertainty in mathematics and the sciences, and my generation was shaped by change and uncertainty." Statistics Canada has noted that the cohort is sometimes referred to as the Internet generation, as it is the first generation to have been born after the popularization of the Internet. In Japan, the cohort is described as neo-digital natives, a step beyond the previous cohort described as digital natives. Digital natives primarily communicate by text or voice, while neo-digital natives use video or movies. This emphasizes the shift from PC to mobile and text to video among the neo-digital population. In March 2018, survivors of the Stoneman Douglas High School shooting, themselves members of Generation Z, started to refer to themselves as the mass shooting generation. Date and age range definition. Statistics Canada defines Generation Z as starting with the birth year 1993. Statistics Canada does not recognize a traditional millennials cohort, and instead has Generation Z directly follow what it designates as children of baby boomers. Randstad Canada describes Generation Z as those born between 1995-2014. Australia's McCrindle Research Centre defines Generation Z as those born between 1995-2009. Starting with a recorded rise in birth rates, and fitting their newer definition of a generational span with a maximum of 15 years. A 2014 report from Sparks and Honey describes Generation Z as those born in 1995 or later. In Japan, generations are defined by a 10-year span with neo-digital natives, beginning after 1996. A 2018 report from Pew Research Center defines post-millennials as born from 1997 onward, choosing this date for key political, economic and social factors, including September 11 terrorist attacks. This date makes post-millennials 4 years of age or younger at the time of the attacks, so having little or no memory of the event. Pew indicated they would use 1997 for future publications, but would remain open to date recalibration. An earlier 2014 publication from Pew Research included the year 2000 as start year for the cohort, as part of an interview with Paul Taylor, author of The Next America, Boomers, Millennials, and the Looming Generational Showdown. The Futures Company, marketing agency Frank N. Magid Associates, and the Shan Group use 1997 as the first year of birth for this cohort. A 2016 report from multinational banking firm Goldman Sachs describes Generation Z as those born after 1998. MTV described Generation Z as those born after December 2000. For a survey conducted by the network regarding possible names for the cohort, the American Marketing Association describes Generation Z as those born after September 11, 2001, suggesting the cohort should be dubbed Gen 9/11, arguing, all children born after September 11, 2001, will experience a world totally different from all generations that preceded it. The Asia Business Unit of Corporate Directions Incorporated describes Gen Z as born between 2001-2015, and Philippine Retailers Association describes Generation Z as born after 2001. Hawthorne Yilhau defines the cohort as people born from approximately 2005-2025, but describes the dividing line between Generation Z and Millennials as tentative, saying, "You can't be sure where history will someday draw a cohort dividing line until a generation fully comes of age." Howe says that the Millennials range beginning in 1982 points to the next generation's window starting between 2000 and 2006. Characteristics. According to Forbes, the generation after Millennials, Generation Z, which they defined as people born from the mid-1990s to the early 2000s, made up 25% of the U.S. population, making them a larger cohort than the baby boomers or millennials. Frank N. Magid Associates estimates that in the United States, 54% are Caucasian, 24% are Hispanic, 14% are African American, 4% are Asian, and 4% are multiracial or other. Generation Z are children of Generation X, but they also have parents who are millennials. According to Public Relations Society of America, the Great Recession has taught Generation Z to be independent, and has led to an entrepreneurial desire, after seeing their parents and older siblings struggle in the workforce. A 2013 survey by Ameritrade found that 47% in the United States were concerned about student debt, while 36% were worried about being able to afford a college education at all. This generation is faced with a growing income gap and a shrinking middle class, which all have led to increasing stress levels in families. Both the September 11 terrorist attacks and the Great Recession have greatly influenced the attitudes of this generation in the United States. However, unlike the older millennials, Generation Z typically have no memories of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, since the oldest members were not yet cognizant when the 9/11 attacks occurred. There is no generational memory of a time the United States was not at war with the loosely defined forces of global terrorism. Turner suggests it is likely that both events have resulted in a feeling of unsettlement and insecurity among the people of Generation Z with the environment in which they were being raised. The economic recession of 2008 is particularly important to historical events that have shaped Generation Z, due to the ways in which their childhoods may have been affected by the recession's shadow. That is, the financial stresses felt by their parents. A 2014 study Generation Z Goes to College found that Generation Z students self-identify as being loyal, compassionate, thoughtful, open-minded, responsible, and determined. How they see their Generation Z peers is quite different from their own self-identity. They view their peers as competitive, spontaneous, adventuresome, and curious. All characteristics that they do not see readily in themselves. In addition, some authors consider that some of their competencies, such as reading competence, are being transformed due to their familiarity with digital devices, platforms and texts. A 2016 U.S. study found that church attendance during young adulthood was 41% among Generation Z, compared to 18% for millennials at the same ages, 21% of Generation X, and 26% of baby boomers. Generation Z is generally more risk-averse in certain activities than earlier generations. In 2013, 66% of teenagers had tried alcohol, down from 82% in 1991. Also in 2013, 8% of teenagers never or rarely wear a seatbelt when riding in a car with someone else, as opposed to 26% in 1991. Research from the NEE Casey Foundation conducted in 2016 found Generation Z youth had lower teen pregnancy rates, less substance abuse, and higher on-time high school graduation rates compared with millennials. The researchers compared teens from 2008 and 2014 and found a 40% drop in teen pregnancy, a 38% drop in drug and alcohol abuse, and a 28% drop in the percentage of teens who did not graduate on time from high school. Technology and social media. Generation Z is the first cohort to have internet technology readily available at a young age. With the web revolution that occurred throughout the 1990s, they have been exposed to an unprecedented amount of technology in their upbringing. As technology became more compact and affordable, the popularity of smartphones in the United States grew exponentially. Anthony Turner characterizes Generation Z as having a digital bond to the internet, and argues that it may help youth to escape from emotional and mental struggles they face offline. According to U.S. consultants Sparks and Honey in 2014, 41% of Generation Z spend more than 3 hours per day using computers for purposes other than schoolwork, compared with 22% in 2004. In 2015, an estimated 150,000 apps, 10% of those in Apple's App Store, were educational and aimed at children up to college level. While researchers and parents agree the change in educational paradigm is significant, the results of the changes are mixed. On one hand, smartphones offer the potential for deeper involvement in learning and more individualized instruction, thereby making this generation potentially better educated and more well-rounded. On the other hand, some researchers and parents are concerned that the prevalence of smartphones may cause technology dependence and a lack of self-regulation that may hinder child development. An online newspaper about texting, SMS, and MMS writes that teens own cell phones without necessarily needing them. As children become teenagers, receiving a phone is considered a rite of passage in some countries, allowing the owner to be further connected with their peers, and it is now a social norm to have one at an early age. An article from the Pew Research Center stated that nearly 3/4 of teens have or have access to a smartphone and 30% have a basic phone, while just 12% of teens 13 to 15 say they have no cell phone of any type. These numbers are only on the rise, and the fact that the majority own a cell phone has become one of this generation's defining characteristics. As a result of this, 24% of teens go online almost constantly. One study has shown that teenagers in 2012 were more likely to share different types of information than teenagers in 2006 were. However, they will take certain steps to protect certain information that they do not want being shared. They are more likely to follow others on social media than share, and use different types of social media for different purposes. Focus group testing found that while teens may be annoyed by many aspects of Facebook, they continue to use it because participation is important in terms of socializing with friends and peers. Twitter and Instagram are seen to be gaining popularity in members of Generation Z, with 24% of teens with access to the internet having Twitter accounts. This is, in part, due to parents not typically using these social networking sites. Snapchat is also seen to have gained attraction in Generation Z, because videos, pictures, and messages send much faster on it than in regular messaging. Speed and reliability are important factors in members of Generation Z choice of social networking platform. This need for quick communication is presented in popular Generation Z apps like Vine and the prevalent use of emojis. One study found that young people use the internet as a way to gain access to information and to interact with others. Mobile technology, social media, and internet use have become increasingly important to modern adolescents over the past decade. Very few, however, are changed from what they gain access to online. Youths are using the internet as a tool to gain social skills that they then apply to real-life situations and learn about things that interest them. Teens spend most of their time online in private communication with people they interact with outside the internet on a regular basis. While social media is used for keeping up with global news and connections, it is mainly used for developing and maintaining relationships with people with whom they are close in proximity. The use of social media has become integrated into the daily lives of most Gen Zers who have access to mobile technology. They use it on a daily basis to keep in contact with friends and family, particularly those who they see every day. As a result, the increased use of mobile technology has caused Gen Zers to spend more time on their smartphones and social media, and has caused online relationship development to become a new generational norm. Gen Zers are generally against the idea of photoshopping, and they are against changing themselves to be considered perfect. The parents of the Gen Zers fear the overuse of the internet by their children. Parents dislike the ease of access to inappropriate information and images, as well as social networking sites where children can gain access to people worldwide. Children reversely feel annoyed with their parents and complain about parents being overly controlling when it comes to their internet usage. Gen Z uses social media and other sites to strengthen bonds with friends and to develop new ones. They interact with people who they otherwise would not have met in the real world, becoming a tool for identity creation. According to Twenge, the negative side of the iGen is they are less face-to-face, due to the extensive use of smartphones. They are also known to feel more lonely and left out. The survey of U.S. teenagers from an advertising agency J. Walter Thompson claims that the majority of teenagers are concerned about how their posting will be perceived by people or their friends. 72% of respondents said they were using social media on a daily basis, and 82% said they thought carefully about what they post on social media. Moreover, 43% said they had regrets about previous posts. Jason Dorsey, who runs the Center for Generational Kinetics, stated in a TEDx Houston talk that this generation begins after 1996 to present. He stressed notable differences in the way that millennials and Generation Z consume technology, in terms of smartphone usage at an earlier age. 18% of Generation Z thinks that it is okay for a 13-year-old to have a smartphone compared with earlier generations that say 4%. The development of technology gave mobility and immediacy to Generation Z's consumption habits. The on-demand economy, defined as the economic activity created by technology companies that fulfill consumer demand via the immediate provisioning of goods and service, has made changes in the way goods or services are delivered to consumers. Only the generation that grows up in the center of this transformation period will establish themselves as an immediacy-demanding consumer. Research conducted in 2017 reports that the social media usage patterns of this generation may be associated with loneliness, anxiety, and fragility, and that girls may be more affected than boys by social media. According to 2018 CDC reports, girls are disproportionately affected by the negative aspects of social media than boys. Researchers at the University of Essex analysed data from 10,000 families, from 2010-2015. Within each family, they examined children who had grown from 10-15 during these years, and assessed their mental health utilizing two perspectives: happiness and well-being throughout social, familial, and educational perspectives. At age 10, 10% of female subjects reported social media use, while this was only true for 7% of the male subjects. By age 15, this variation jumped to 53% for girls, and 41% for boys. This percentage influx may explain why more girls reported to experience cyberbullying, decreased self-esteem, and emotional instability, more than their male counterparts. Other researchers hypothesize that girls are more affected by social media usage, because of how they use it. In a study conducted by the Pew Research Center in 2015, researchers discovered that while 78% girls reported to making a friend through social media, only 52% of boys could say the same. However, boys are not explicitly less affected by this statistic. They also found that 57% of boys claimed to make friends through video gaming, while this was only true for 13% of females. Another Pew Research Center survey conducted in April 2015 reported that women are more likely to use Pinterest, Facebook, and Instagram than men. In counterpoint, men were more likely to utilize online forums, e-chat groups, and Reddit than women. Cyberbullying is more common now than in millennials, the previous generation. It's more common among girls, because they tend to use social media more. This results in young girls feeling more vulnerable to being excluded and undermined, while boys take matters into their own hands, resulting in something more physical. More than twice as many girls as boys said they had been cyberbullied in the last year. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?